The wind at the Stone Hollow Creek didn't just blow. It scoured. It was a high, thin sound, a sound of isolation, and it had been the only noise for the last hour of the wagon's rattling journey. When the heavy wheels finally groaned to a halt, the silence that rushed in felt louder, heavier, and more judgmental than the wind ever could. This was it, the end of the line. A place that looked like the world had forgotten it, a scattered collection of gray wood buildings huddled against a vast, indifferent sky. Elara grasped the splintered side of the wagon, her knuckles white. Every arrival was the same hope, so thin it was transparent, and the same crushing weight of reality. She took a breath, held it, and then swung herself down. Her boots hit the dust with a soft thud, a sound that seemed to echo in the stillness. And then the eyes found her. They always found her. From the shaded porch of the general store, two men stopped talking, their gazes snagging on her frame. Near the dry trough, a woman in a faded sunbonnet paused, her hand halfway to her mouth, and Elara didn't need to hear the whisper to know its shape. She could feel the word forming on their lips, the same word that had chased her from the last town and the one before that. Big, heavy, obese. It was a brand, seared onto her skin, invisible, but felt by everyone. She tugged her worn shawl tighter, a useless gesture. It couldn't hide the breadth of her shoulders, the solid, undeniable space she occupied. A flush of heat, hot and acidic, crawled up her neck. This was the part she hated, the moment of assessment, the moment where every person she passed measured her, weighed her, and found her wanting. She was not a person. She was a spectacle, a curiosity, a problem to be solved or, more often, ignored. Her last employer, a baker's wife, back in Miller's Crossing, had been kind until the customers weren't. "It's just distracting, dear," she'd said, unable to meet Elara's eyes. "The men, well, it's not proper. Distracting. Improper. Too much." Elara forced her chin up. She would not cry. Not here. Not in the middle of a dusty street with the wind tearing at her skirts. She had one last chance. One name whispered by the stagecoach driver 3 days ago. A place far out of town. A place as isolated as she felt. A ranch run by a man, they said, was as cold and vast as the land itself. Silas Vane. A low chuckle drifted from the porch. She flinched but kept walking, her gaze fixed on the wagon driver as he unloaded her single battered trunk. He set it down, took her money without a word, and climbed back onto his seat, eager to leave, eager to get away from this forgotten place and perhaps from her. As the wagon rattled away, the silence descended again, broken only by the creak of a sign swinging in the wind. Stone Hollow Creek. Even the name felt empty. She stood alone, the town's quiet judgment pressing in on her from all sides. She had been foolish to hope. This place was no different. But where else was there to go? She had worked since she was old enough to hold a broom, worked harder than any 3 of the whispering women on that porch. Her hands were calloused and strong. Her back was built for labor. She wasn't delicate. She wasn't pretty. And she had long ago accepted that love was a luxury reserved for other women, women who were built of finer, thinner material. But she could work. She could earn her keep. She looked past the edge of the town, toward the high, barren ridges that rolled away into the distance. Out there somewhere was the Stone Hollow Ranch. Out there was Silas Vane, a giant, they called him, a man of stone, haunted by some old grief. Elara bent, gripped the rope handle of her trunk, and took the first step. The dust swirled around her ankles. The whispers followed her like ghosts, but she kept moving. She didn't need their kindness. She didn't need their acceptance. She just needed a chance to prove She was more than the body they despised. She just needed work. The ranch was her only hope. The giant was her last. The walk was longer than she expected, a winding dirt track that climbed steadily away from the town, leaving the last gray roof behind until there was nothing but the vast, pale sky and the endless rolling hills. The wind was a constant companion, pushing at her back, whipping strands of hair from her tight bun. Her trunk, small as it was, felt like it was filled with stones. She had to stop twice, setting it down, her breath coming hard, her palms raw from the rope handle. There was no sound but the wind and the scuff of her own boots. It was a land that didn't want people. When the ranch finally appeared, it was less a home than a scar on the landscape. Long, low buildings, their wood weathered to the color of bone, huddled together. A windmill turned with a slow, mournful squeal. There was no sign of life, no smoke from the chimney, no horses in the wide, empty corral. For a moment, she thought it was abandoned, a ghost ranch, and a cold dread, deeper than the wind's chill, settled in her stomach. She set her trunk down near the porch of the main house and wiped her dusty hands on her skirt. She was about to call out when a man emerged from the barn, carrying a bridle. He was wiry and mean-looking, with eyes the color of rust and a mouth pulled into a permanent scowl. He stopped dead when he saw her. His gaze did exactly what the town's gaze had done. It swept over her, quick and insulting, lingering on her waist, her hips, and then dismissing her. "We ain't hiring," he snapped, his voice as sharp as the wind. Elara's throat tightened. I heard you might need help. I can cook, I can mend, I can clean. I'm a hard worker." The man spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust near her feet. "Cook?" He let out a short, ugly laugh. "Reckon you do your fair share of tasting, too. We got no room for extras." He turned his back, a clear dismissal, and started coiling the bridle. Tears, hot and stinging, blurred her vision. This was it, the final door, slammed in her face. She had walked all this way for nothing. She was about to turn, to pick up her trunk and walk back to that hateful town with nowhere to go, when another shadow fell across the yard. It wasn't a shadow, it was a man. He emerged from the dark interior of the barn, and the foreman's words, "ain't hirin'," died in his throat. Elara felt her own breath catch. The stagecoach driver hadn't been exaggerating. He was a giant, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. He moved with a slow, deliberate quiet that was more intimidating than any noise could ever be. His face was all harsh lines and shadow under the brim of a worn hat, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, clear gray, like creek water in winter, and they were filled with a pain so old and deep it looked like bedrock. He stopped, his gaze falling on Elara, then on her trunk, then on the foreman, who was now studying the dirt. The silence stretched, heavy and absolute. This was her last chance, the very last. The humiliation with the foreman, the memory of the baker's wife, the whispers in the street, it all rose up in her, threatening to choke her. She had nothing left to lose. Honesty, raw and brutal, was the only coin she had. She forced herself to meet those cold, grieving eyes. Her voice came out not as a plea, but as a broken, brittle statement of fact. "I'm just the obese girl, sir." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. The foreman flinched, but Silas Vane's expression didn't change. "I know what they see," she pushed on, her voice trembling but gaining a desperate strength. "But I can work. I can work harder than anyone you've ever had. Just Don't expect love. I'm not here for that. I'm just here for the work." The foreman's ugly laugh was a crack in the silence, sharp and final. It was the sound of a nail being hammered into a coffin. "Work," he sneered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Lady, just looking at you is work." The words struck Elara with a physical force, knocking the last bit of air from her lungs. This was it. The humiliation was complete. She had laid herself bare, offered up her deepest shame as a shield, and he had shattered it with a single lazy insult. Her eyes burned, and she stared at the dust by her boot, willing the ground to open up. She had nothing left. No words, no fight, no hope. She had made herself a fool. Then a pair of heavy boots stepped into her line of sight. The foreman's laughter choked off, as if a hand had closed around his throat. The world went utterly still. Elara could feel, more than see, the giant rancher move. Silas Vane took one slow step toward her, and the very air in the yard seemed to grow heavier, denser. Elara tensed, squeezing her eyes shut for a brief second, bracing for the final blow. Now would come the deeper voice, the colder dismissal, the order to get off his land. A man this powerful, this broken, would surely have no patience for a creature as pathetic as she. She forced herself to look up. His face was still in shadow, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, his pale gray eyes, were fixed on her. He wasn't looking at her body with the sneering contempt of the foreman or the leering curiosity of the men in town. There was no heat in his gaze. There was no pity. It was an assessment. It was the way a man might look at a horse, checking its teeth and its legs. He was measuring her, but not her waist or her hips. He was looking at her hands, red and raw from the trunk. He was looking at the solid, grounded way she stood, even as she trembled. The silence stretched, lasting an eternity. Elara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Finally he spoke. His voice was not a shout. It was low and rough, like stones grinding together, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Love isn't part of the wages, miss." Elara blinked. The world tilted slightly. What had he said? "Work is," Silas Vane continued, his gaze unwavering. "The north barn roof needs mending. Shingles are stacked by the woodshed. You can start in the morning. Mess hall's in the back. You'll find a bed there." He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't offered a hand. He had simply answered. He had heard her desperate, trembling confession, "I can work, but don't expect love." And he had processed it not as an emotional plea, but as a business negotiation. Elara's mouth fell open. She had built a fortress of shame around herself, and he had walked right past it as if it weren't even there. He hadn't acknowledged her obesity. He hadn't acknowledged her love. He had heard only one word: work. Beside her, the foreman was sputtering, his face a mask of disbelief. "But, boss, she's a—" Silas turned his head just slightly. He didn't look at the foreman, but his next words cut the man off. "She starts in the morning." It was final. He took a step back, the intensity of his presence receding, and turned his broad back to them. He walked toward the barn, his long, slow strides eating up the ground, and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Elara standing in the dusty yard, her mind reeling, her world completely, terrifyingly unanchored. The ranch settled into a harsh rhythm. Elara's work, a silent testament, had begun to fill the spaces left by neglect. The fences were straighter. The barn roof was a solid dark line against the sky, and the mess hall stove was always warm when the men came in, though Elara herself was rarely seen. She worked on the edges, a solitary, solid figure moving against the vast landscape. The quiet pact between her and Silas continued, a language of actions. He left a whetstone on the porch. She left his mended saddle blanket, the stitching neat and strong, folded on the railing. Neither spoke of it. Then the sky changed. The high, pale blue hardened, then bruised, taking on a sickly greenish-yellow tint. The wind, usually a constant cry, fell utterly silent. The air became so still it felt like a held breath, thick and heavy. The animals knew. Cattle on the far ridge gathered, lowing uneasily. The horses in the corral paced, snorting and tossing their heads. Elara was reinforcing a loose gait when Riggs stalked past. "Storm's coming," he muttered, his eyes on the horizon. "A bad one. That green sky means hail." It began not with rain, but with a roar. The wind returned not as a cry, but as a physical blow, slamming the barn doors against their hinges. Then came the hail, not as pellets, but as ice, as stones, driving from the sky like bullets. It shredded the leaves, pounded the dry earth, and sent the animals into a blind panic. Elara and the men fought to get the horses into the barn, the ice stinging their faces, the noise a deafening, chaotic thunder. The storm was as violent and brief as a gunshot. It passed in 20 minutes, leaving the world shattered and gleaming. The ground was white. The air smelled of ozone and broken pine. "Damn it," Riggs spat, looking out. "The Colt." Silas was already moving. The ranch's most valuable and most volatile asset was a young black colt, born of wild stock, that Silas had been trying to gentle for a year. It was his private project, a creature as untamed and remote as he was. They found it on the far side of the pasture. The hail had driven it mad. It had tried to jump the new fence line, the one Elara had just built, and had failed. It was a tangled, bloody mess. Barbed wire was wrapped around its left foreleg, cinched tight to the bone. The horse was on its side, heaving, its eyes white with terror and pain. "He's done," Riggs said, his voice flat. "Tendon's cut for sure. No coming back from that. It's a mercy to put him down." Silas stood over the animal, his giant frame rigid. His face was granite, but Elara saw his hands, those scarred, strong hands, clench and unclench at his sides. This colt was more than just livestock. It was something he understood. He looked at the mangled leg, at the wild, terrified eye, and a shadow of his own deep grief passed over his face. He nodded once, curtly. "Get my rifle." Riggs turned a little too quickly to obey. Elara's heart hammered. She saw the horse, broken and trapped, and she saw the man forced to destroy the one wild thing he seemed to care about. "No." The word was quiet, but it cut through the air. Both men froze. Riggs turned, his face dark with disbelief. Silas looked at her, his pale eyes narrowing. "No," she said again, louder, stepping forward. She ignored Riggs, her gaze fixed on Silas. "You don't get to—" "Miss," Silas said, his voice a low warning, "this is ranch business. Step aside." "It's not business. It's a waste," she said, her voice shaking but finding its strength. "He's just scared. The wire is tight, but it's not through the bone. Not yet. You shoot him now, you're just giving up." "It's a dumb animal," Riggs snarled. "It'll kill itself, or you if you get close." "He's not dumb," Elara said, never taking her eyes off Silas. "He's just in pain." She dropped to her knees in the mud and ice, ignoring the ruined leg, and focused on the colt's head. She didn't try to touch him. She just knelt, making herself small, and she began to talk. A low, soft murmur, the words unimportant, just a sound of calm in the midst of the pain. "It's all right. Storm is over. It's all right. I see you. I'm not going to hurt you." The colt's ears twitched. It still heaved, but the frantic, panicked edge lessened. "Riggs," Silas said, his voice quiet, "get the wire cutters. The medical kit from the house. Now." For the next 2 days, Elara did not leave the Colt's side. She moved from the field to a stall in the barn, but she never left. Silas and another hand had managed to cut the wire and move the horse. A dangerous, fraught-filled ordeal, but the real work had just begun. The leg was a mess, ribbons of torn flesh. Elara cleaned it, her touch firm but gentle, stitching what she could, binding it with salve and clean bandages. She sat on a stool in the straw, the barn dark and quiet, long after the other men had gone to bed. She talked to the Colt, that same low murmur, telling it about the baker's wife, about the long walk to the ranch, about the color of the sky. The Colt, who had never let a human touch it, stood on 3 legs. Its head hung low and listened. It watched her. On the 3rd morning, Silas came in before dawn. He always did, checking the stock. He stood in the shadows, watching her. Elara was exhausted, her face pale, her hands stained with blood and salve, but she was still there, bathing the swelling, changing the bandage. She didn't hear him. She finished her work, gave the Colt a piece of apple she'd saved, and stroked its neck. And for the first time, the wild, broken horse didn't flinch. It didn't pull away. It turned its head slowly and rested its muzzle against her shoulder. Its breath warm on her neck, it was a gesture of absolute trust, of surrender. Elara's eyes closed, a single tear tracing a line through the grime on her cheek. She leaned her head against the Colt's, a quiet moment of healing, of 2 broken things finding a moment of peace. In the shadows, Silas Vane stood perfectly still. He had watched her defy him. He had watched her sit in the mud and the cold for 2 days, refusing to give up on something everyone else had declared broken. He had watched her take the wildest, most pained creature on his ranch and gentle it, not with force, but with a patience he had never witnessed. He looked at her, this solid, quiet woman who asked for nothing, and saw a strength that dwarfed his own. He had seen her work. Now, he had seen her heal. He turned, silent as the shadows he came from, and walked out of the barn, the image of her and the Colt burned into his mind. The incident with the Colt shifted something. The quiet on the ranch was no longer empty. It was watchful. The other hands treated Elara with a new, rough respect. She wasn't just the big girl. She was the woman who had faced down Silas Vane and saved the black Colt. Riggs, however, was a different story. His silence was corrosive, his resentment a tangible thing. He saw the new gloves, he saw the way the Colt nuzzled her hand, and he saw the way Silas's gaze would sometimes linger on the mess hall, where a light now burned late. A month passed. The supplies, which Riggs usually handled, ran low. Silas, it seemed, was determined to break the ranch's isolation. He stopped Elara by the barn, his voice its usual low rumble. "We ride to town. The mess hall is your domain. You'll write the list. You'll pick the supplies." Elara's heart seized. Town. The whispers. The stairs. She hadn't left the ranch since the day she'd arrived. "Sir, I can just write the list for you." "You'll come," he said. It wasn't a request. The ride was silent, the wagon wheels grinding on the dry track. When they reached the edge of Stone Hollow Creek, Elara felt the familiar heat rise in her neck. The whispers started instantly, but they were different now. Before it was simple mockery. Now it was laced with a sharp, resentful curiosity. They weren't just staring at her. They were staring at her next to him. The giant rancher, who hadn't been seen in town for months, was now acting as a wagon driver for her. They went to the general store first. The air was thick with unasked questions. Elara kept her eyes down, her voice low as she listed her needs: flour, salt, beans, coffee, and a new whetstone for the kitchen knives. Silas stood by the door, his sheer size filling the space, a silent, brooding guardian. He paid in cash, his movements economical, and loaded the sacks onto the wagon. It was when they were leaving that Riggs stepped out of the saloon, a bottle in his hand. He was drunk, his face flushed. He had clearly ridden in earlier, and the sight of them, together, seemed to ignite something vicious in him. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "Look what we have here. The giant himself, playing chaperone." Silas didn't stop, just continued loading the last sack. "Go back to your bottle, Riggs." "Oh, I'm just curious," Riggs sneered, taking a few unsteady steps toward them. A few men had drifted out of the saloon, sensing a confrontation. "We all are. Heard you got yourself a new pet, Silas?" Elara froze. Her hand, halfway to the wagon rail, stopped. Riggs's eyes raked over her, cruel and appraising. His audience was growing. "One that's big enough to keep you warm in the winter, eh?" He let out a barking laugh. "Guess you got tired of that cold bed. Had to find the biggest blanket in the territory." The laughter that followed was sharp and brutal. It was the laughter of the porch, the laughter of the baker's wife, the laughter she had heard her entire life, all rolled into one. It hit her, and it broke her. She didn't flinch. She simply froze. All the strength she'd found on the ranch, the confidence from mending the roof, the quiet pride from healing the Colt, it all evaporated. She was just the obese girl again, a public joke, standing in the dirt. Her vision blurred, and she stared at nothing, her entire being focused on not letting the tears fall. The street went quiet. The laughter died, replaced by a tense, hungry anticipation. Every eye, the men from the saloon, the woman from the store, even the blacksmith from across the street, was fixed on Silas Vane. They were waiting for the giant's move. Would he laugh it off? Would he shove the girl aside, embarrassed? Would he, as Riggs clearly hoped, affirm the joke and put her back in her place? Elara's breath was trapped in her chest. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't bear to see the flicker of shame in his eyes, the moment he would finally realize what a burden, what a spectacle she truly was. She waited for his boots to move, to walk away from her, to leave her standing alone in the circle of their mockery. The incident with the Colt shifted something. The quiet on the ranch was no longer empty. It was watchful. The other hands treated Elara with a new, rough respect. She wasn't just the big girl. She was the woman who had faced down Silas Vane and saved the black Colt. Riggs, however, was a different story. His silence was corrosive, his resentment a tangible thing. He saw the new gloves. He saw the way the Colt nuzzled her hand. And he saw the way Silas's gaze would sometimes linger on the mess hall, where a light now burned late. A month passed. The supplies which Riggs usually handled ran low. Silas, it seemed, was determined to break the ranch's isolation. He stopped Elara by the barn, his voice its usual low rumble. "We ride to town. The mess hall is your domain. You'll write the list. You'll pick the supplies." Elara's heart seized. Town. The whispers. The stairs. She hadn't left the ranch since the day she'd arrived. "Sir, I can just write the list for you." "You'll come," he said. It wasn't a request. The ride was silent, the wagon wheels grinding on the dry track. When they reached the edge of Stone Hollow Creek, Elara felt the familiar heat rise in her neck. The whispers started instantly, but they were different now. Before, it was simple mockery. Now it was laced with a sharp, resentful curiosity. They weren't just staring at her. They were staring at her next to him. The giant rancher, who hadn't been seen in town for months, was now acting as a wagon driver for her. They went to the general store first. The air was thick with unasked questions. Elara kept her eyes down, her voice low as she listed her needs: flour, salt, beans, coffee, and a new whetstone for the kitchen knives. Silas stood by the door, his sheer size filling the space, a silent, brooding guardian. He paid in cash, his movements economical, and loaded the sacks onto the wagon. It was when they were leaving that Riggs stepped out of the saloon, a bottle in his hand. He was drunk, his face flushed. He had clearly ridden in earlier, and the sight of them, together, seemed to ignite something vicious in him. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "Look what we have here. The giant himself, playing chaperone." Silas didn't stop, just continued loading the last sack. "Go back to your bottle, Riggs." "Oh, I'm just curious," Riggs sneered, taking a few unsteady steps toward them. A few men had drifted out of the saloon, sensing a confrontation. "We all are. Heard you got yourself a new pet, Silas." Elara froze. Her hand, halfway to the wagon rail, stopped. Riggs's eyes raked over her, cruel and appraising. His audience was growing. "One that's big enough to keep you warm in the winter, eh?" He let out a barking laugh. "Guess you got tired of that cold bed. Had to find the biggest blanket in the territory." The laughter that followed was sharp and brutal. It was the laughter of the porch, the laughter of the baker's wife, the laughter she had heard her entire life, all rolled into one. It hit her, and it broke her. She didn't flinch. She simply froze. All the strength she'd found on the ranch, the confidence from mending the roof, the quiet pride from healing the Colt, it all evaporated. She was just the obese girl again, a public joke standing in the dirt. Her vision blurred, and she stared at nothing, her entire being focused on not letting the tears fall. The street went quiet. The laughter died, replaced by a tense, hungry anticipation. Every eye, the men from the saloon, the woman from the store, even the blacksmith from across the street, was fixed on Silas Vane. They were waiting for the giant's move. Would he laugh it off? Would he shove the girl aside, embarrassed? Would he, as Riggs clearly hoped, affirm the joke and put her back in her place? And Elara's breath was trapped in her chest. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't bear to see the flicker of shame in his eyes, the moment he would finally realize what a burden, what a spectacle she truly was. She waited for his boots to move, to walk away from her, to leave her standing alone in the circle of their mockery. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but the silence was not the empty, aching void that had defined their lives before. It was a new quiet, filled with the weight of words spoken, of choices made. The wagon wheels ground into the dirt, a steady, rhythmic sound. The vast sky, which had once seemed so indifferent, now felt like a canopy, a shelter. Elara sat on the high seat, her hand still enclosed in his, resting on the bench between them. She could feel the rough calluses of his palm against her own, a silent, powerful connection. She was no longer just the obese girl. She was not just a worker. She was, in this moment, simply Elara, and he was Silas. She looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. His profile was still harsh against the setting sun, a face carved from the same rock as the canyons around them. But the granite had shifted. The deep, bedrock grief in his eyes was still there. She knew it would always be a part of him, just as her own scars would be a part of her, but it was no longer the only thing. There was warmth there now, a quiet light in the gray. He hadn't just defended her work, he had defended her. He had taken her greatest shame, the word she'd used as a shield and a curse, and he had redefined it. Strong. He had seen the power in the body she had only ever felt as a burden. When they reached the ranch, the sun was a bleeding line of orange on the horizon. The air was cool and smelled of dust and pine. He pulled the wagon to a stop, but didn't move to get down. He just sat, holding the reins loosely in one hand, his other still holding hers. "Riggs won't be back," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question or a guess. It was a statement of fact. Elara nodded. She felt no victory in it, only a quiet, sad finality. "The house," he started, then paused, as if the words were new to him. "The main house. It's too quiet, too empty." He turned to her, his gaze direct and unflinching. "That grave. It was my wife and my son. A fever 3 years back. It took everything. I've been living in the barn since." Elara's heart ached. She understood. She understood the isolation, the turning away from a world that had only offered pain. She tightened her grip on his hand. "I'm sorry, Silas." "I'm not," he said, and it took her a moment to understand. "I'm not sorry, Elara. Not anymore. A man can get used to the cold. He can forget what warmth feels like. Until it comes back." He looked from her face to the cold, dark ranch house. "It's been a long time since anyone put a light in those windows." Elara looked at the house, at its dark, empty gaze. It was no longer a symbol of his grief. It was just a house. It was just wood and stone waiting. Elara looked at the house, at its dark, empty gaze. It was no longer a symbol of his grief. It was just a house. It was just wood and stone waiting. "I know how to build a fire," she said, her voice soft. A small, slow smile touched the corner of his mouth, a gesture so rare it changed his entire face. "I know you do." He released her hand, climbed down from the wagon, and then turned. He didn't just offer a hand to help her down. He stood solid as the earth and simply waited. Elara swung herself down, her boots landing softly in the dust. They stood for a moment, the space between them no longer a gulf, but a shared ground. He didn't need to say, "I love you." He had said, "I expect nothing else." He had said, "You were wrong." He had said, "strong." She had come to Stone Hollow looking for work, expecting nothing but tolerance. She had found a broken man and a broken ranch. And in the process of mending them, she had somehow mended herself. She was not the obese girl. She was the woman who built roofs. She was the woman who gentled wild things. She was the woman who had brought a giant back from the dead. Silas took the first step toward the main house, his long shadow stretching out in the dusk. Elara fell into step beside him, her own shadow merging with his, and together they walked toward the dark, quiet house to light the first fire. The West wasn't just won by gunfire. It was won by hearts like Elara's and Silas's, hearts that knew how to endure, how to heal, and how to find strength in the broken places. If you believe in the power of these quiet human stories, then you belong here with us. Follow True Western Stories to keep these tales alive. Subscribe and join a community that knows true courage isn't always loud. We're honored to share this journey with you. Until the next story.